Hi, thank you, thank you. Yeah, we're almost done indeed. Thank you for being here, guys. Actually, I would like to take a moment to thank all the organizers and the sponsors who made the event possible. So I hear that it's growing every year, so I'm glad to be a small part of it. So I'm Daniele with Pipedrive. Who here has implemented an app or some kind of integration using OAuth? Can you raise your hand? All right, so it's been a pleasure, and I'll see you next time, guys. No, okay. So I guess I will talk quickly about how it works and the flow and everything for those of you who are not familiar with it, and then we'll jump into some more specific things that we learned in Pipedrive while rolling out OAuth for our marketplace. So just to give you a little bit of context, Pipedrive is a CRM for salespeople. We have a lot of cool features. We focus a lot on activities. But I'm not here to talk about the products. So, but just to give you some numbers, it's an Estonian company. It was founded in 2010. We are growing very rapidly. These are some numbers. They're always not up to date. But the point is that we're growing very rapidly, and as good as we try to make the product, we also know that it's kind of impossible to make one thing that covers every possible need that salespeople have, and that's why we decided to create a marketplace. So it's a space where other companies, other developers can create apps and integrations that work with Pipedrive to cover those needs that we don't cover natively. And one of the first to create these apps, you need to use OAuth, as like many of you already know. But it's also one of the main requests for support that we have received throughout the past few years. And so the idea for the talk is to explain how OAuth works for those of you who are not familiar with it, but also maybe cover some things that are not so obvious and are not so clear in the specifications. So let's start with the definition, as usual. So OAuth is an open standard for access delegation. So if we go back in time in 2010, 2007, for example, before the first version of OAuth was implemented, if you wanted to use, for example, let's say an application to manage your inbox, like your Gmail account, you would have to share the password. And we all know that it's not the best solution because you don't want to give away all that control. But also, if you share your password with like 10 applications, then you cannot revoke just one of these applications. Because if you change the password, you change it for everybody. So that's why OAuth was implemented. It acts pretty much like a bouncer, and it sits in between the two applications. And based on rules that the user decides, can grant permission to certain application and revoke permission to other application and so on. So why do you need OAuth? Again, you're all probably familiar with API key. Who here knows what an API key or an API token is? Okay. Okay, so it's just it's pretty much like a password. It's a string that you can include with your API calls to authorize them. Okay, it's the simplest way that you have to authorize API calls, probably. It's easy to implement and it's fast for internal use. Like if you want to build an integration that is just for your company, like things that you have 100% control over, and you're the only user, API keys are probably the fastest way to go. But they're not the best if you want to develop something and make it public to the whole world. Why? Because, first of all, it's complicated for the final user. Why is it complicated? So if you build an app that needs to have an API key, you have to ask the final user to give you the API key. So they will have to copy-paste the key at some point. So that's not the best user experience. And again, same problems that you have with passwords. So you need to request global access, and if you change your API key, you break the integration with all of the applications. With OAuth 2, on the other hand, you have one-click installation. How many of you have done like a login with Google or with Facebook? Okay, it's pretty much the same thing. Usually it's OpenID Connect, which is a different protocol that has an extra layer on top of OAuth, but it's pretty much the same thing. So it's very easy to install an application. And you can define scopes. A scope is a certain subset of data that you can specify that your app needs to have access to in order for it to work. So the final user can see exactly what your app is trying to do and is much more comfortable with it and is much more likely that they will try your application as well. So how does the flow work? There are some actors involved. There is the client application. For example, in this case is Asana. We have an app for Asana on the marketplace. There is the final user, and there is the server. The server is, there's a lot going on in the server. There's an authentication server and so on, but for simplicity, we'll just call it Pipedrive here. So for the final user, you just have the install button, you install the application, and the application is installed. Magic. So the app needs to be registered on the server. So when you create it, you are given a client ID and a client secret. And that's how you identify that specific app on the authorization server. And there you can see the scopes. So when I create an app, I can say, if you want to use this app, you need to give me access, like full access to context or whatever. So let's take a look a little bit deeper in the flow. So the flow starts, the client application asks the authorization server to show the user the page where they need to grant permission, and if the user agrees, then the authorization server redirects to the client with what's called an authentication code. And everything here is visible, so it's on the front end. You can read the authentication code on the browser. Then the client app makes a server-to-server request to the authorization server, passing this authorization code, and it receives an access token and what's called a refresh token as well, and we'll see what that is later. The access token is the point of the whole thing, is the goal. So the client application needs to have an access token to make API calls for that specific user. So they can just use this access token included in the API call in a header. We'll see how that works. And they receive the response for that specific endpoint. Then after a while, the access token expires. It's usually 1 hour, but it really depends on the provider. And the client app needs to request a new access token, sending a refresh token and receiving a new access token in return. So let's take a look at the flow again, but from the user perspective. So you install the application again, and you can see here we have the client ID and the redirect URI. This is also registered when you create the application, and this means this is where the authorization server redirects the final user when they click on allow and install with the grant permission to the application. So if they do, they are redirected to the client app with this code in the URL. How it is called, it can change depending on the provider, but the flow is always the same. You receive this authentication code in the URL. So the client app can take this code now and make the server-to-server request to the authorization server. And here, how many of you use Postman? Okay, it's just a tool to make API calls. It's very nice, you can see them visually. But yeah, it's the same concept with whatever you use. So, and also the variables, they can change depending if you're building something for GitHub, Spotify, Shopify, whatever, they can change. But the concept is the same. You send the authorization code and you receive an access token and a refresh token. There's also a recap of the scope that you can have access to and the expiry time for that specific access token. Once you have that access token, you can use it to make API calls, and you just need to include it as a header. Postman, in this case, does that for you, but the header is simply bearer, space, and the access token. That's all you need to do, and you receive the response for that specific endpoint. And also the refresh token is the same thing. You just send the refresh token and receive a new access token. Now here, these calls are made to Pipedrive, and you can see that in the response, there's also another refresh token, but which is actually the same that I'm sending. So why is that like this? It's that way because actually we used to reissue refresh tokens, new refresh tokens all the time. So if you ask for a new access token, we would also give you a new refresh token. Okay, so that would invalidate the one that you had before. This is how we started. And then we started having a lot of developers contacting us saying, your route server isn't working, there's something wrong. Please help us, blah, blah, blah. And so we started taking a look, a lot of failed requests. So we started taking a look at what other platforms do. Excuse me. Do I have water? Thank you. And so Spotify, for example, this is the response for the first access token request. You get a refresh token, but then when you send the refresh token to get a new access token, thank you so much, you only get the access token. You don't get a refresh token. So that means that you have one refresh token that is long-lived, will last forever, and you can reuse it infinite times. GitHub, they don't even give you a refresh token. So they send you an access token the first time, and that's what you can use forever. So how come? Why is there such flexibility? It's because, by definition, it's optional. So it's up to you when you implement an OAuth server to decide if you want to reissue refresh tokens or not. Should you? I don't know. Maybe it can add a layer of security, which could be debatable. Honestly, I don't know if it actually does in the end, but it definitely adds a layer of complexity that most developers are usually not used to, turns out. How many of you, those who have actually implemented apps using OAuth, have used reissued refresh tokens? Okay. How many of you have used long-lived refresh tokens? That's interesting. Okay. So maybe our target developers are different than the audience. Can be one explanation. But anyway, this is our data. This is what it shows. If you implement an OAuth server, I would say don't reissue refresh tokens. It helped the situation a lot for us. We also created a custom endpoint to turn API tokens into basically an already installed OAuth app. We made this because we had a lot of integrations that used API tokens, but we wanted to help them transition to actually OAuth apps. So we made this endpoint. I think is really cool. Feel free to copy it if you want. How much time do I have? Yeah. Okay, cool. So I would like to talk about the state parameter and cross-site request forgery attacks in OAuth because it's often not so clear. Who knows here what a cross-site request forgery attack is? How many of you know exactly how it works in OAuth? Okay, cool. So yeah, it's not so obvious. It's not explained also that well. If you Google it and try to read online, you find different sources. So I would like to clarify a little bit as far as I can. So first of all, the state parameter is a recommended parameter that can be used in the flow. Recommended, which means you don't have to use it, but you probably should. And it's a parameter that can prevent this kind of attacks. It's just a string that is bounced back and forth between the client and the server. The server sends it back to the client as it is, doesn't touch it, and this parameter alone can prevent these kind of attacks. But what are actually these attacks? So if you read online, you read something like, often, if you don't use this parameter, an attacker could gain access to a victim's resources, which is kind of true, but is not precise. So it's not so much about the attacker gaining access to a victim's resources per se, but it's more like tricking the victim into saving data, thinking that they're saving it on their own account, while in reality they're saving it on the attacker's account. So let's see how it works. To recap, in a normal flow, The authorization server generates an authentication code for that specific user. The user is redirected to the client with the code. The code is exchanged for an access token, which is also linked to that specific user. The client receives the access token and can now use it. So the user can through the client, can make these API calls to send in, for example, in this case, a new lead. Okay, that ends up on the resource server, linked to that specific user because the access token is for that user. So in a cross-site request forgery attack, the attacker starts the flow like any other user. So an authorization code is generated for the attacker, but then instead of being redirected to the client with this code, they intercept the request, and they have the victim go to that same URL with an authorization code that is now linked to the attacker's account. So code is exchanged for an access token, and now the data is sent by the user, but using an access token that is linked to the attacker's account. And so there you go, the data ends up in the attacker's account. So how does the state parameter prevent this? The state, this string is generated by the client app, and it's a string that identifies uniquely that specific session, which means that specific user. And so this parameter is passed with each step of the flow. And so when you are redirected to the client, you have the authorization code, but you also have this state parameter, which identifies your session. So the attacker also has a state that is linked to that specific session. And if they try to have the victim go to the client now with also this state added, it's very easy for the client to see that the session that is making the request and the session that should actually be linked to that state parameter do not match. And so the request can simply be rejected. So it's something that is optional by specification, so I don't think we will ever enforce it in Pipedrive, but if you are building an app with OAuth, I would highly suggest that you use it. It's relatively easy, doesn't cost much, and you can save a lot of trouble. So these are pretty much the things that I've been talking about. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, just thank you for your time, guys. Thank you for listening, and I guess I will see you at the drink up later.
Thank you, Daniele. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? So I have a quick one, maybe. So
yeah.
The OAuth specification is actually not too broad. They just define the token exchange mechanism, and then you basically have to use something else for authentication, like OpenID Connect 2.0 or something, which is then very complicated. So is there anything like in between so that I don't have to, so for example, from the perspective of someone who will implement a resource provider, is there anything in between that isn't as complicated as OpenID Connect that will solve the authentication part of the story?
Honestly, I didn't hear everything perfectly, so can you repeat just the final part? Is there anything? So
is there anything simpler than OpenID Connect 2.0 for us who would like to implement the authentication part of the story?
External providers that handle everything for you. Yes, that's an answer, yeah. Other than that, other protocols, not that I'm aware of. Yeah. Maybe they do. All right.
Thanks.
All right.
Any other questions? No? If not, thank you, Daniele.
Thank you, guys.
And I'll see you back in a few.